It was a typical Tuesday morning for Jalen Thompson as he boarded Flight 237 from Chicago to New York. He had just finished a busy week at work, handling a major contract for his company, and this trip was supposed to be routine. His mind wandered between thoughts of the upcoming meeting with the client, the small details of his life back home, and the weather forecast for New York. Jalen was a man of few distractions, his days marked by deadlines and meetings, but today, for some reason, something felt different. Maybe it was the feeling of being on autopilot, a bit too comfortable with his life. He couldn't quite place it. As he walked down the narrow aisle of the plane, he glanced at the other passengers. The usual array of business travelers, students, and vacationers. Nothing unusual. He was a frequent flyer, well versed in the quiet rituals of air travel, seatbelt fastened, phone on airplane mode, overhead bin checked. He slid into his seat by the window, placing his briefcase under the seat in front of him. A sense of calm settled over him. The low hum of the engine outside, the slight rocking of the plane as it prepared for takeoff, Jalen had been here before. Nothing would go wrong. Or so he thought. The flight attendants began their pre-flight routine, walking down the aisle, ensuring everyone was settled. Jalen noticed one flight attendant, a woman in her late 30s, with short cropped hair and a tight, professional smile. Her name tag read Susan. She stopped in front of Jalen's seat for a moment, glancing down at her clipboard. "Excuse me, sir, can you confirm your seat number?" she asked, her tone clipped but polite. Jalen paused, slightly confused. "Yes, 15C, he said, pointing to the seat on the boarding pass in his hand. 15C? That's odd, Susan muttered under her breath. This seat is assigned to someone else. She looked at Jalen again, this time with a raised eyebrow. "Could you double-check your ticket?" Jalen frowned, puzzled by her sudden change in demeanor. "I've already checked it, ma'am. This is my seat." "Are you sure there's a mistake?" Susan didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for her headset and whispered something into it. Jalen could hear snippets of the conversation, but nothing made sense. "We've got a mix-up in 15C. Please confirm," she said in a hurried tone. Her eyes scanned the cabin as if searching for someone or something, and then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the metal floor. Jalen sighed, leaning back in his seat. This was a minor inconvenience, but nothing he couldn't handle. He returned to his thoughts, zoning out for a moment, distracted by the soft chatter of the other passengers and the faint rumble of the engines. But things took a turn when Susan returned with a flight supervisor, a man in his mid-40s, dressed in a navy blue uniform. His name tag read Carl. Carl approached Jalen with a serious expression on his face. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to exit the plane. There's been a mix-up with your ticket. Please come with me." Jalen blinked, disbelief flooding over him. "What? I've already confirmed my seat, and I..." Carl raised his hand, cutting him off. "Sir, I understand your frustration, but this is a security matter. We'll resolve this at the gate. Please don't cause any further issues." "Security matter?" Jalen echoed, his voice rising. The last thing he wanted was a scene, but this was absurd. "I don't know what's going on here, but you're making a mistake. I've had this ticket for weeks." Susan and Carl exchanged a quick glance, and Carl's jaw clenched. "I'm afraid you'll have to step off the plane, sir," he said with finality. Jalen felt his heart race as he stood up, gathering his things. His thoughts raced, trying to understand what had gone wrong. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that nothing made sense. As he stepped into the aisle, the entire row of passengers turned to look at him. He caught glimpses of their puzzled and sympathetic faces. Some shook their heads, others seemed indifferent, but all of them stared. "Please follow me," Carl said, his voice firm. Jalen's mind was spinning. He was being escorted off a plane for something he couldn't even begin to comprehend. His legs felt heavy as he made his way toward the front of the plane, his briefcase bumping against his leg with each step. The weight of the situation began to sink in, and by the time they reached the door, Jalen's stomach was in knots. "Can I at least get an explanation?" Jalen asked, his voice edged with frustration. Carl opened the door, signaling for him to step into the jet bridge. "We'll sort this out at the gate. Right now, you're creating a disturbance. Please cooperate." As Jalen stepped into the jet bridge, the cool air of the airport hit him like a slap in the face. The moment the door closed behind him, the sense of surrealism heightened. He had been kicked off the plane, with no explanation, no reason given, just a vague promise that it would be resolved later. His mind raced with questions. What had just happened? Was this some kind of mistake? Was there a deeper issue here that he didn't understand? Jalen's frustration morphed into confusion. He wasn't a troublemaker. He followed the rules. He had never been in trouble at an airport before. This didn't feel real. At that moment, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from an old acquaintance. It was from Henry Daniels, the CEO of a major airline. Jalen had crossed paths with several years ago during a business conference. "Hey Jalen, I just heard about what happened. Call me when you can. I think we need to talk." Jalen's heart skipped a beat. Henry Daniels was a big name in the airline industry, and the fact that he knew about what had just occurred was, frankly, unsettling. But there was something else, something that Jalen couldn't quite explain. It was a strange feeling, a sense of being in the right place at the right time. Could this bizarre incident be the start of something bigger? Something that could change his life forever? As he made his way toward the gate, still processing everything, Jalen knew one thing for sure: his ordinary day had just turned into something extraordinary. What seemed like a minor inconvenience would soon spiral into a life-altering series of events that no one, including Jalen, could have anticipated. The moment he picked up the phone and dialed Henry's number, he had no idea that his world was about to be completely flipped upside down. And in just 7 minutes, he would be in the position to change not only his own life but the future of the entire airline industry. As the phone rang, Jalen took a deep breath, knowing this was only the beginning. The phone rang twice before Henry Daniels answered, his voice deep and calm. "Jalen, good to hear from you. I've been following the situation, and it's hard to believe what I'm hearing. What's going on?" Jalen leaned against the wall of the jet bridge, still trying to catch his breath after the surreal experience of being kicked off the plane. His mind was a whirlwind of confusion, frustration, and curiosity. "Henry, I honestly don't know. I've been flying for years, never had a problem. And now, I've been kicked off a flight over something that doesn't make sense. They said it's a security matter, but I wasn't given any details. I'm completely in the dark here." Henry paused for a moment before responding. "You don't have to explain further. I know exactly what this is about. The airline you were flying with? They're struggling right now. Bad press, bad leadership, a lot of internal problems. And it sounds like you were just caught in the crossfire." Jalen shook his head, bewildered. "What are you talking about? What does that have to do with me? I've never been involved with that airline beyond a few casual flights. This doesn't make sense." "Trust me, it will. But before we get into it, let me ask you a question, Jalen. Do you want to fix things? Do you want to make things right?" Henry's voice was steady, but there was something in it that caught Jalen's attention. There was an underlying seriousness in his tone, as though the conversation had just taken a turn into unknown territory. Jalen's mind raced. What did he mean by "fix things"? Was this some kind of twisted offer? Was Henry suggesting he could help, or was he just toying with him? But the more Jalen thought about it, the more he realized he had nothing to lose. His life had just been turned upside down by an event that made no sense, and now he had someone like Henry offering help. What did he have to gain by saying no? Of course, I want to make things right. But how? How can I fix this? Jalen asked, his voice steadier than he felt. There was a brief silence on the other end before Henry spoke again. Here's the thing, Jalen. The airline industry is a cutthroat business, and the company you were flying with is in turmoil. They've been dealing with bad decisions from the top down. Leadership is in disarray. And right now, they're desperate for someone with fresh ideas, someone who can step in and take charge. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but I think you could be that person. Jalen felt his stomach twist. You're asking me to step into some sort of CEO role? Of a company that just kicked me off a flight? What kind of game is this, Henry? Are you serious? I'm dead serious, Henry replied, his voice unwavering. You were just a passenger on that flight, but they didn't know who you were, Jalen. They didn't know what kind of connections you have or what you could bring to the table. But I do. You've got the business acumen, you've got the vision, and you've got the ability to turn things around. This is your chance to change everything, not just for you, but for the entire airline. Jalen ran his hand through his hair, trying to process what he was hearing. He had always considered himself someone who was good at problem solving, but this was on another level. The idea of stepping into a leadership position at a failing airline, especially one that had just kicked him off a plane, was ludicrous. Yet there was something compelling about Henry's offer. He could feel the gravity of the situation, the weight of the opportunity. Okay, Jalen said slowly, his voice full of uncertainty. Say I believe you. Say I actually agree to take on this responsibility. What's in it for me? And more importantly, how do I even begin to turn this mess around? Henry's tone shifted, becoming more pragmatic. What's in it for you? Well, let's just say the airline industry doesn't forget those who make big moves. You'll have the chance to lead a company, make a name for yourself, and turn a sinking ship into something profitable. And as for how you start, first, we need to make sure that the company understands who you are. We'll take care of the details, the paperwork, everything. But I need you to be ready. You have 7 minutes to get to the gate, and then we'll move forward. 7 minutes. Jalen's mind struggled to keep up with the pace of the conversation. 7 minutes? What kind of decision was that? But then he realized, Henry wasn't talking about a literal 7-minute window. He was talking about something else. Something more symbolic. It was the time it would take for everything to change. His world would shift in the time it took to board another flight or catch a train to another city. All right, let's do it, Jalen said, his voice now full of determination. I'm in. But what do I need to do? Meet me at the headquarters, Jalen. I'll have everything arranged. You'll be in charge by the end of the day. But before you make any moves, remember, you have to make the board see you as the solution. You're not just someone trying to make things right for yourself, you're doing it for the entire company. For every employee, every passenger who's been let down by their leadership. Jalen took a deep breath, processing Henry's words. This was bigger than anything he had ever imagined. From being kicked off a flight to potentially running the entire airline, it didn't make sense. But sometimes, in the most chaotic moments, there was opportunity. Jalen knew that. And now, he had to seize it. I'll be there, Jalen said, his voice steady. I'll take this on. I won't let you down. Good man, Henry replied. You've got what it takes, Jalen. Let's make history. As Jalen ended the call, he stared at the ground beneath his feet, the weight of the decision settling in. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure, his life was about to change in a way he never thought possible. In just 7 minutes, he would step into a world of power, responsibility, and unprecedented opportunity. The airline that had rejected him, the airline that had humiliated him, was now the very company he would reshape with his vision and leadership. But as Jalen stood there in the jet bridge, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about a career or a company. This was about something deeper. Something more profound. He was about to become part of a story that would change everything, an ordinary man, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, with a chance to leave a legacy that no one would ever forget. The question now was, would he be able to turn the ship around before it sank further into chaos, or would he find himself overwhelmed by the weight of the responsibility? Only time would tell. But one thing was certain, Jalen Thompson had just stepped into a life that was anything but ordinary. Jalen arrived at the airline's headquarters, a sleek, modern building nestled in the heart of the city's business district. It was hard to believe that only a few hours earlier, he had been unceremoniously kicked off a plane, treated as if he didn't belong. Now, he was walking through the front doors of the very company that had cast him aside, ready to claim a position he had never imagined himself in. Inside the lobby, a few employees shuffled around, oblivious to the change that was about to take place. Jalen walked to the receptionist, who looked up at him, not recognizing him as anyone significant. He wondered how many of these people had any idea that their company was teetering on the edge of disaster. Most of them probably just showed up every day, did their work, and went home, unaware of the turmoil brewing behind the scenes. "I'm here to see Henry Daniels," Jalen said, his voice calm but filled with an undercurrent of purpose. The receptionist nodded and gestured to the elevators. "You'll find him on the top floor," she said with a neutral tone, not even questioning his presence or why someone who appeared to be just another disgruntled passenger had come to their headquarters. Jalen pressed the button for the elevator, feeling his heart rate spike. As the doors closed, he took a deep breath. He had always been a man of logic, a problem solver at his core. But this was different. He wasn't walking into a situation where he could fix things with spreadsheets or strategies. He was about to walk into the lion's den, a place where decades of poor leadership and questionable decisions had led to the company's near collapse. And he, an unknown passenger with no prior connection to the airline, was expected to turn it around. The elevator doors opened to a sleek, open-plan office space, the walls lined with glass windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. At the far end of the room, a man stood by a desk, his back to the door. It was Henry. Jalen had never met him in person, but he could tell by the man's posture, his confidence, that he wasn't just some corporate drone. Henry had a presence about him, something that spoke to years of experience in the high-stakes world of business. "Jalen," Henry said, turning around as he heard the door open. His voice was calm, authoritative, yet there was a warmth in it that immediately put Jalen at ease. "I'm glad you're here. We've got a lot of work ahead of us." Jalen walked toward him, still trying to wrap his mind around the situation. "I'm ready. But I need to understand what you're asking me to do. How do I even begin to fix this company?" Henry smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. "It's not about fixing it, Jalen. It's about changing the direction. Right now, this airline is on a path to destruction. But the truth is, the company isn't broken. The leadership is. We need someone who can make tough decisions, someone with a fresh perspective. And that's where you come in." Jalen looked around the room, trying to absorb everything Henry was saying. "But I'm just a guy who got kicked off a plane. I'm not a corporate executive. I don't have years of experience running an airline." "Experience is important," Henry acknowledged, "but it's not the only thing that matters. What matters is your ability to see the big picture, to understand people, and to take bold action when others hesitate. Most importantly, you've got something that this company desperately needs, the trust of the people. When they hear your story, when they realize what you've been through, they'll believe in you. You'll have their support." Jalen wasn't sure he understood fully, but he trusted Henry. After all, The man had been right about everything so far, about the airline's problems, about the opportunity that lay before him. Maybe, just maybe, Jalen was the one who could make the difference. Okay, so what's the first step? Jalen asked, feeling the weight of the decision settle on his shoulders. Henry motioned to a nearby chair. Let's sit down and go over the details. You need to understand the full scope of the situation before you can take charge. As they sat, Henry began to outline the airline's struggles. The company had once been a dominant player in the industry, known for its reliability and customer service. But over the past few years, a series of bad decisions, from overpriced acquisitions to questionable leadership changes, had sent it into a downward spiral. Customer satisfaction was at an all-time low, employees were disillusioned, and the company's stock price had plummeted. Your first priority is to rebuild the trust of the passengers, Henry explained. We've lost sight of what made this airline great in the first place: personal service, attention to detail, and a genuine commitment to the people we serve. You need to make sure that every flight, every interaction with a passenger, reflects that commitment. Jalen nodded. It sounded simple enough, but he knew it wouldn't be easy. Rebuilding trust was a slow process, and it required more than just changes to customer service. It required a complete overhaul of the company's culture, a shift in the way employees and passengers alike saw the airline. Once you've stabilized things with the passengers, we can focus on the internal issues, Henry continued. The staff needs leadership. They need to see that you're not just another corporate suit looking to make a quick buck. You need to be someone they can believe in. Someone they can follow. Jalen felt a flicker of doubt. He wasn't a corporate leader. He wasn't someone with decades of experience managing a company. But then he remembered the flight, the way he had been treated like a nobody, dismissed without reason. He could change that. He could be the one to show everyone that a company wasn't just about profits, it was about people. And if he could change the way employees felt about the company, he could change the way they treated passengers. It would be the first step toward turning the airline around. All right, Jalen said, determination hardening his resolve. Let's do this. What's next? Henry leaned back in his chair, a glimmer of approval in his eyes. You've got a meeting with the board in an hour. I'll be with you every step of the way, but you're going to have to take charge. Walk in there like you own the place, because by the end of this meeting, you will. Jalen swallowed hard, his stomach tight. He had never imagined himself in this position, about to face a room full of skeptical executives, all wondering if the man who had been kicked off a plane just hours earlier had what it took to lead them to success. But now that he was here, he felt a surge of confidence he had never experienced before. This was his moment. He wasn't going to let fear dictate his actions. Let's go, Jalen said, his voice steady. I'm ready. As they made their way to the boardroom, Jalen couldn't help but wonder how this was all going to play out. But one thing was certain, he wasn't backing down. Not now. Not ever. When the doors to the boardroom opened, Jalen walked in with his head held high, ready to face the challenge ahead. The members of the board looked at him, some with skepticism, others with curiosity. They had no idea who he was, what he had been through, or why he was there. But they were about to find out. And Jalen was about to show them all that sometimes, the most unexpected people are the ones who can change everything. The boardroom was silent as Jalen took his seat at the head of the long, polished table. The room, which was usually filled with seasoned executives and high-powered decision-makers, felt strangely cold to him. But he wasn't intimidated. He had spent years navigating far more dangerous situations than this. His confidence was unshakable. As he surveyed the faces around the table, he could see a mix of skepticism, curiosity, and judgment. They all wondered the same thing: what was this young man doing here, and why should they trust him? Henry stood beside him, his silent support like a shield. He'd told Jalen to take control, and now it was his turn to prove he could handle it. The room shifted slightly as the chairman, a tall, aging man with graying hair and a permanent scowl, cleared his throat. "We're all here, Jalen. The floor is yours," the chairman said, his voice carrying an air of condescension. "But I'm sure we all want to know exactly why you think you're the solution to our problems. Why you, of all people, should be the one to lead us out of this mess." Jalen stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. He knew he had to tread carefully, that this was his chance to either inspire or lose the room entirely. He adjusted his posture, squaring his shoulders, and looked the chairman squarely in the eye. "It's simple," Jalen began. "I'm here because I know what it's like to be discarded. I've been that person who was overlooked, underestimated, and treated as if I didn't matter. But what you don't know is that I'm also the person who knows how to turn that anger, that frustration, into action." He paused, letting his words sink in. Around the table, some eyes narrowed, while others looked intrigued. "You've made your mistakes, but more importantly, you've lost sight of what really matters: people. Your customers, your employees. You've treated this airline as a business, but you've forgotten that businesses are made of people. And those people are what drive everything. If you want to fix this, it's not about profits or stocks or fancy mergers. It's about rebuilding trust. Trust with your passengers. Trust with your staff. And trust with your community." The chairman scoffed, clearly unconvinced. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Jalen's response was calm but firm. "You lead with empathy, not arrogance. You show people that you care, not just in the way you talk, but in the way you act. You fix the little things that have been ignored for years: the cleanliness of your planes, the attitude of your staff, the efficiency of your systems. But most of all, you create a culture where your employees feel valued, not like cogs in a machine. You make them part of something bigger." He looked at each of them, his gaze steady. "And that's why I'm the one who can make it happen. Because I'm not coming from inside your bubble. I'm not a corporate insider with decades of experience. I'm someone who can see things from a completely different perspective. I'm someone who's been in the trenches, who knows what it's like to be treated poorly, and who knows how to turn that around. I'm not just here to lead, I'm here to inspire." There was a pause, and for a moment, Jalen thought the room might burst into laughter. But it didn't. Instead, he saw a subtle shift in the board members' expressions. Some looked thoughtful, others uncomfortable. The chairman, still skeptical, leaned forward, his fingers steepled together. "You talk a good game, Jalen. But you don't have the experience, the expertise to manage this company. Running an airline isn't about just caring about people, it's about hard decisions, business strategy, and understanding the numbers. What makes you think you're qualified to take on something this big?" Jalen leaned in slightly, his voice unwavering. "Because I understand the most important part of business, leadership. I understand people. I know how to inspire loyalty and create a culture where success follows. The rest? That's just the mechanics. I'll surround myself with the right people, people who have the technical know-how to handle the operations. But at the end of the day, it's about the relationships you build with the people who work for you, with the people who fly with you." Henry, standing silently beside him, finally spoke up. "You're right, Jalen. You may not have the corporate background these folks are used to seeing, but what he brings to the table is more important. The airline is sinking, and it's not because we lack experience, it's because we've forgotten what made us great in the first place." Jalen shot Henry a brief, appreciative glance before returning his attention to the board. "I'm not here to change the way you run things behind the scenes. I'm here to change the way you interact with the world. The way you make your customers feel, the way you make your employees feel. That's where it all starts." A few of the board members looked at each other, exchanging glances, unsure of what to make of this. The chairman, however, seemed less than impressed. He shook his head. "This is all very idealistic, Jalen. But at the end of the day, it's about results. If you can't turn this airline around and prove your ideas work, we'll be out of business before long. And frankly, I don't think someone with no real experience in this industry can do that." Jalen smiled, a quiet confidence radiating from him. "Give me a chance. I'll prove it to you." The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Henry nodded, his expression one of support, but it was clear the board was still hesitant. The chairman looked around the room, his eyes scanning the faces of the other members, who were all looking to him for guidance. After what felt like an eternity, he finally sighed and leaned back in his chair. "All right, Jalen. You've got your chance. But we'll be watching you closely. If you can't deliver results, we'll have no choice but to move on." Jalen nodded, relieved but resolute. "I won't let you down." As the meeting came to a close, Jalen stood, shaking hands with each board member, feeling their skepticism but also sensing the faint stirrings of something else, doubt, yes, but also the flickering of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he was the one who could turn this ship around. With the right team and a clear vision, he could reshape this company into something its employees could be proud of and its passengers could trust again. As he left the boardroom, Henry clapped him on the back, a smile spreading across his face. "Well done, Jalen. That was impressive." Jalen nodded, his mind already racing with the next steps. This was only the beginning, and the hard work was just about to start. But for the first time, he felt like he had a real shot at making a difference. Now it was time to take the fight to the people, employees and passengers alike, and prove that someone with the right heart and vision could do what the so-called experts never could. This was the moment he had been waiting for. And he was determined not to waste it. The next few weeks passed in a blur of meetings, phone calls, and brainstorming sessions as Jalen began his journey to change the airline. His vision was clear, but executing it was a whole different challenge. The first hurdle was the culture of the company. The employees, many of whom had been with the airline for decades, were deeply entrenched in a way of doing things that Jalen knew needed to change. It wasn't that they weren't skilled, many of them had been in their roles for years and were experts at what they did. But somewhere along the way, the sense of pride and passion had been lost. They had become accustomed to routine, to doing things because that's the way they'd always been done, not because it was the best way. And to make matters more complicated, Jalen was still seen as an outsider, someone who hadn't earned his stripes in the corporate world. There were moments of doubt, moments when Jalen wondered if he was in over his head. But he didn't let those thoughts linger for long. He had a goal, and nothing was going to stop him from achieving it. He began by talking to people on the front lines, the flight attendants, gate agents, pilots, and customer service reps. He needed to understand their frustrations, their challenges, and what they thought the company was lacking. He also wanted to hear about the moments that made them proud to work for the airline, the moments when they felt they were making a difference. These conversations, while sometimes difficult, were invaluable. They gave him insight into the real issues and the hidden potential that was lying dormant. One of the first changes Jalen implemented was a new customer service training program. He knew that it was essential to rebuild trust with passengers. But instead of focusing solely on efficiency and technical skills, he insisted that the program emphasize empathy, patience, and respect. It was a departure from the old, rigid training model, but Jalen was convinced that the airline's success wasn't just about getting people from point A to point B, it was about the experience they had along the way. Jalen's message resonated with the frontline staff, who were eager for change. Many of them had grown disillusioned with the company's top-down management style and were excited to see someone who genuinely cared about their opinions. They appreciated Jalen's willingness to listen, and that small but significant shift in attitude started to build momentum. But there were still many within the company who were resistant to change, especially in the upper echelons of the corporate structure. The board, though initially supportive, had begun to grow wary of Jalen's unconventional approach. They were all too aware of the state the airline was in. They knew something had to change, but they weren't sure if Jalen's bold ideas were the answer. There were rumors swirling about his lack of experience and questions about whether his emphasis on employee morale and customer service was enough to reverse the airline's financial struggles. As the weeks passed, the pressure from the board began to mount. They wanted results, and they wanted them fast. Jalen, however, refused to buckle under the pressure. He knew that the changes he was making wouldn't show instant results, they were investments in the future. But he also understood that the longer the company stayed on its current path, the harder it would be to recover. He had to keep moving forward, no matter what. His next big challenge came when a major storm system hit, grounding flights across the country. The airline was hit hard, with thousands of passengers stranded at airports. In the past, this would have been a disaster. Passengers would have been frustrated, angry, and left feeling abandoned by the airline. But Jalen saw it as an opportunity to prove his new approach. He rallied the staff, pushing them to go above and beyond to help stranded passengers. Flight attendants handed out snacks, gate agents made extra efforts to find alternate flights, and customer service representatives worked around the clock to assist with rebooking. One flight attendant, Teresa, who had been with the airline for over 20 years, stood out during this crisis. She was one of the many who had initially been skeptical of Jalen's leadership but had come to appreciate his focus on employee well-being. As the storm raged outside, Teresa found herself comforting a mother with 2 young children who were terrified of flying. She listened to the woman's worries, reassured her, and even managed to get her and her kids priority boarding on the next available flight. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was exactly the kind of personal attention that Jalen had been advocating for. When the dust settled after the storm, the feedback from passengers was overwhelmingly positive. They were grateful for the empathy and care they had received during a difficult time. It wasn't just about getting them to their destination, it was about how they were treated along the way. This was exactly what Jalen had been pushing for, and it was a moment of validation for him. The board, however, remained cautious, still waiting for tangible results in terms of financial performance. A few weeks later, Jalen faced a major test, an emergency landing in the middle of the night. A malfunction with one of the aircraft's engines had forced the pilots to make an unplanned stop at a small airport in the middle of nowhere. The passengers were scared, frustrated, and disoriented. In the past, this situation would have been handled with cold professionalism, with minimal contact from management. But Jalen knew this was another opportunity to show the world what his vision for the airline looked like in practice. Without hesitation, Jalen boarded a plane bound for the airport. He met the passengers as they disembarked, personally apologizing for the inconvenience and offering them assistance. He made sure every passenger had accommodations for the night and was given food and drinks while they waited for the next available flight. It wasn't a perfect solution, but Jalen's approach was personal, human, and transparent. The next morning, Jalen held a press conference, addressing the situation head-on. He explained the technical issue, reassured the public that safety was never compromised, and promised to make the experience right for the affected passengers. He didn't shy away from the mistakes that had been made but took responsibility for the airline's part in the disruption. The response from the media was overwhelmingly positive. They praised Jalen for his transparency, his willingness to take accountability, and his focus on the human side of the airline's operations. This was exactly the kind of leadership the public had been craving. But more importantly, it was a moment of breakthrough for Jalen. The airline wasn't just a business, it was a community, and he was the one holding it all together. Back at the headquarters, the board was growing increasingly nervous. They had been watching the situation closely, and while they acknowledged the positive media coverage, they were still fixated on the bottom line. The airline was losing money, and they weren't sure how much longer they could afford to support Jalen's unconventional methods. Their patience was running thin, and they made it clear that unless he could show real financial improvement, his position as CEO might be in jeopardy. Jalen was undeterred. He knew that the foundation of his strategy was solid, but it was going to take time. And time was something the airline didn't have. With the pressure mounting, Jalen made the difficult decision to take a calculated risk. He announced a major overhaul of the airline's pricing structure, aimed at making it more accessible to a wider range of passengers. This move was risky. It could either pay off big or send the airline into deeper financial turmoil. But Jalen was willing to gamble. The next few weeks would be critical. The gamble was huge, and if it didn't pay off, it could be the end of Jalen's tenure. But as he looked out at the storm clouds brewing in the distance, he couldn't help but feel that he was on the cusp of something bigger than just a turnaround. This wasn't about saving a business, it was about reshaping an industry, about changing the way people saw airlines, and about giving hope to those who had been written off. The only question now was, could he do it? As Jalen prepared for the final push to turn around the airline, the pressure continued to mount. The decision he had made to overhaul the pricing structure was bold, but it was far from guaranteed to succeed. There were moments of doubt that crept into his mind, but Jalen pushed them aside, focusing on his vision of an airline that was both profitable and people-focused. The financials, though, were becoming harder to ignore. Despite the positive media coverage and the goodwill he'd gained with the employees and passengers, the numbers just weren't adding up. The board, ever the pragmatists, was demanding results, and soon. Then, one fateful day, the numbers came through. Bookings had surged. It wasn't just a slight uptick either, it was a significant increase in passenger demand, particularly from new customers who had been hesitant to fly with the airline before. The pricing changes, combined with the renewed emphasis on customer experience, were beginning to bear fruit. More and more people were choosing the airline not just for its affordability but for the reputation it had developed for being responsive and human. The gamble was paying off, at least for now. Still, Jalen knew this was just one step in a much larger process. The company was on the road to recovery, but it would take years to truly rebuild the trust that had been lost in the past. Even as the customer base expanded, Jalen was careful not to become complacent. He doubled down on his strategy of transparency and customer-first service, continuing to push for improvements across every department of the airline. He regularly communicated with employees, encouraging them to share ideas for how to make things better. He didn't just want their compliance, he wanted their commitment to the company's new mission. Meanwhile, the board members began to soften. They could see that the airline was turning around. Jalen's leadership was starting to show tangible results, and the passengers who had once been skeptical were now loyal. However, the transition was still far from complete. A major challenge loomed on the horizon: competition. As Jalen knew all too well, the airline industry was incredibly volatile, and rivals were quick to copy anything that worked. The success of his pricing overhaul was not going to be enough to ensure long-term success unless the company could continue to, in time, innovate. In the face of this challenge, Jalen's focus on employee empowerment became even more critical. The airline needed to continue being different, not just in terms of customer service, but in the way it operated internally. Employees were the lifeblood of the company, and they needed to be given the tools to succeed. Jalen had already started implementing new training programs, but now he began pushing for a culture shift that would go deeper than just surface-level change. He wanted a company where every employee felt valued, heard, and integral to the company's success. The next major change came with the introduction of a profit-sharing plan, which allowed employees to share in the success of the company. For many of the staff, this was a game-changer. They weren't just working for a paycheck, they were now stakeholders in the company's future. Jalen knew that when employees felt personally invested in the success of the company, they would go above and beyond in ways that went far beyond what any manager could ask for. In addition to this, Jalen worked closely with the marketing team to reposition the airline as more than just a carrier. He wanted it to be a symbol of a better way to do business, one that prioritized people over profits, one that was unapologetically human. The company's new motto, "Your journey, our priority," wasn't just a catchy slogan, it was a promise. The airline would be known for its personal touch, for making every passenger feel special, no matter how small the gesture. Jalen's emphasis on customer service didn't stop with the employees. He implemented new policies to ensure that passengers had a voice, whether they were flying first class or in coach. Feedback was encouraged at every step of the journey, from booking the flight to disembarking at their destination. The airline's customer service representatives were trained not just to resolve complaints but to proactively seek ways to make passengers' experiences better. Every interaction was an opportunity to exceed expectations. As Jalen's influence spread through the company, he began to receive accolades from unexpected places. Airlines that had once dismissed his methods as impractical now started looking at his strategies as a model for their own operations. Industry leaders were starting to take notice. Jalen had gone from being an outsider, a young CEO with no track record, to a respected innovator. But he wasn't done yet. He had one more challenge in front of him, maintaining the momentum and ensuring that the changes he had introduced would stick long-term. The final test came when a competitor, a larger and more established airline, made a play for the market share that Jalen's airline had worked so hard to build. They attempted to undercut prices and offer a similar level of customer service, hoping to sway passengers who had recently flocked to Jalen's airline. The rivalry quickly escalated, with the competition launching aggressive marketing campaigns that portrayed Jalen's company as a flash-in-the-pan success. They were attempting to chip away at the very foundation that Jalen had worked so hard to build. Rather than retreating or getting bogged down in the competition, Jalen saw this as an opportunity to double down. He knew that his airline's strength wasn't just in its pricing or customer service, it was in the culture he had cultivated, one that prioritized people over profits. He responded with a campaign that emphasized the airline's values and commitment to making every flight more than just a trip from point A to point B. It wasn't about the bottom line for him, it was about creating something lasting, something that would make a real difference in the lives of the passengers who chose his airline. In the end, it was Jalen's authenticity and vision that won the day. The public saw through the competitors' attempts to undermine the airline's success, recognizing that the company was more than just a business, it was a community. As the company continued to grow and expand, Jalen's leadership became the gold standard for what a modern airline could be. The industry as a whole began shifting in the direction Jalen had set, recognizing that passengers weren't just customers, they were people, and the airline industry had a responsibility to treat them as such. Jalen's rise from a boy kicked off a plane to the CEO of an airline was a journey marked by obstacles, setbacks, and doubts. But it was also a story of perseverance, vision, and a deep commitment to change. In the end, it wasn't just about the airline's success, it was about proving that, with the right leadership and the right values, even the most unlikely stories could have the most extraordinary outcomes. And as Jalen looked out at the horizon, watching the planes take off into the sky, he couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning. The airline had been saved, but his journey was far from over. What lay ahead was even bigger, and Jalen was ready for whatever challenges the future would bring.